The sun hadn't yet fully risen over the Musk estate when soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. Elon, having worked late the night before on an engineering proposal for a Mars propulsion system, was still in a light doze when he heard the quiet knock. Standing in the doorway was his young son Jackson, small fingers clutched around the edges of his pajama top, his face pale but calm. Elon sat up, brushing a hand through his hair, expecting a nightmare or a fever. But what Jackson said next caught him completely off guard. With a voice calm and eerily clear, he said he had seen heaven. Elon blinked, expecting a childish dream about clouds or superheroes. But Jackson's tone wasn't playful. It was solemn, even serene. He spoke of a dream unlike any he'd ever had, a glowing place full of light and warmth, music that didn't come from instruments, but seemed to live in the very air, and a figure, neither man nor woman, who spoke to him without moving its lips, telling him things he couldn't fully explain, but still somehow understood. Elon had long dismissed spirituality as poetic misinterpretation, a tool for understanding things science hadn't yet decoded. But Jackson's words weren't dramatic or embellished. They were steady, sincere, and oddly detailed. The child spoke of seeing people without pain, of skies that shimmered like glass, of laughter that rang through the clouds and never faded. He said the being of light told him he would forget most of what he saw, but that one thing must stay in his heart. You are loved beyond measure, and love is why you're here. Elon tried to smile it off, assuming it was imagination or some residue from a bedtime story. But Jackson wasn't smiling. He wasn't even trying to convince anyone. He just turned and walked away, as if he had said something as ordinary as asking for breakfast. That day, Elon couldn't focus. Every meeting felt flat. Every spreadsheet, every technical discussion, it all faded into the background. His son's voice echoed louder than the engineers in the conference room. And as the hours passed, Elon felt something he rarely allowed himself: unease. Not fear, but a quiet, persistent question that gnawed at the walls of his scientific certainty. By evening, Jackson was drawing on the floor of the living room, sprawled out with colored pencils. Elon, curious despite himself, peeked over his shoulder. What he saw made him pause. It was a picture of a place, half surreal, half divine. Trees that floated, rivers that glowed, and in the center a figure with rays emanating from its head, standing above a field of children who looked peaceful. Even in crayon, Elon asked him who the figure was. Jackson replied, "That's who told me we don't have to be afraid anymore." For the first time in decades, Elon had no response. Not because he didn't understand, but because, deep down, some part of him did. The days that followed were quiet but charged with something new, an invisible tension Elon couldn't quite name. Jackson didn't bring up the dream again, but his behavior had changed. He was more patient, more observant. He sat longer in silence, watching birds in the garden or tracing the light on the wall with his fingers. He smiled more often, but not in a giddy, childish way. It was softer, more knowing, almost like he was carrying something sacred inside him. Elon, meanwhile, found himself unraveling. His nights were restless, and when he did sleep, his dreams were filled with fragmented images, stars bleeding into oceans, his mother's voice calling out from across a canyon, the sound of music with no source. He'd never believed in dreams having meaning. But now, each time he looked at his son, he felt the tug of something he didn't want to admit. Maybe there were things even he couldn't fully map out or measure. One morning, after sending an unusually curt reply to a SpaceX executive's email, Elon did something he rarely did. He stepped away from his computer in the middle of the workday. Instead, he sat beside Jackson, who was sketching again, this time using watercolors. The paper was soaked with bright tones, swirls of gold, lavender skies, and an endless staircase disappearing into light. Elon asked him again, gently, about the dream. Jackson looked up, as if expecting the question. He said he didn't remember all of it anymore, but certain pieces stayed. He remembered the warmth of the air. He remembered being held, though he couldn't say by what. And he remembered that time didn't feel real. Everything was now, and everything was forever. But what struck Elon the most was what Jackson said last. It felt like the place where everyone's sadness turns into songs. The words hung in the air, wrapping around Elon's chest like a slow pressure. He had never heard anything like it from a child. Not even from adults, truthfully, and it wasn't poetic for the sake of performance. It felt instinctual, as if Jackson hadn't invented it, but simply passed it along. Elon began to dig. Not in a frantic way, but with focused curiosity. He started reading late into the night, articles on near-death experiences in children, studies on the neurological activity during dreams, ancient texts on visions and prophecy. He found stories of kids across the world describing similar experiences, visions of peace, celestial beings, a sense of being sent back with a mission they couldn't quite articulate. None of it was provable, and yet none of it could be entirely dismissed. Through a trusted connection, Elon reached out to a retired neuroscientist who had spent the last 15 years studying children's spiritual visions. Dr. Mariana Cohen had published controversial work suggesting that these visions weren't hallucinations, but a kind of encoded consciousness the brain accesses under certain conditions, dream states, trauma, or profound emotional moments. Elon wasn't convinced, but he was intrigued. He arranged a quiet, private meeting at his estate, away from the noise of media and research institutions. Dr. Cohen was sharp, gentle, and unapologetically open-minded. When she sat down with Jackson, there was no clinical questioning, just conversation about the dream, about how Jackson felt when he woke up, and what he remembered. She didn't try to validate or disprove anything. Instead, she offered a simple thought. Sometimes children see things not because they imagine them, but because they haven't yet forgotten how to listen. That night, Elon stood by his son's bedroom door longer than usual. Jackson was asleep, curled up with a sketchbook still open beside him. On the page, drawn in light pencil, was a staircase made of stars. At the top, a tiny figure waited with open arms. And for the first time in years, Elon didn't feel the need to explain it. He only felt the need to understand why it had chosen his son. The week that followed felt like a quiet reckoning. Elon, a man driven by innovation and logic, had always trusted the language of systems, inputs, outputs, data streams, trajectories. But now he found himself wrestling with silence. Not the absence of noise, but a presence in stillness. Something vast, something sacred. It wasn't just about Jackson's dream anymore. It was about the shift happening inside Elon, inch by inch, thought by thought. He began spending more time at home. Meetings were postponed or moved online. Engineers and shareholders were surprised by his sudden calm, his unexpected questions. Less about product velocity, more about long-term purpose. He asked about the emotional cost of innovation. He brought up ethics in AI during a review that had nothing to do with it. He stopped talking so much about colonizing Mars and started wondering aloud about what it meant to heal Earth first. But privately, it was Jackson who occupied Elon's thoughts most. His son didn't speak often about the dream anymore, but traces of it lingered in everything he did. The way he arranged stones in the garden to form spirals. The way he hummed to himself while painting shapes he said were feelings. He seemed unbothered by things that used to frustrate him. Broken toys, spilled drinks, even scraped knees. He would simply smile and say, "It's not supposed to last forever." Elon couldn't help but see echoes of his own childhood in that smile. Not the joy, but the lack of it. He remembered being 7 and already feeling the pressure to perform, to understand things no one around him could explain. There had been no softness in his world, only speed, only silence and systems. And now, in watching his son live so peacefully, with uncertainty, Elon realized just how long he had been running from his own longing for connection. One evening, Jackson sat on the floor with a candle in front of him, eyes closed. Elon, watching from the hallway, felt the urge to intervene, some fatherly instinct to question the ritual. But he didn't. He just stood there, breath caught in his throat, as Jackson eventually opened his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Elon asked him who he was thanking. Jackson smiled again. "The light that talked to me. I think it's still with me." That night, Elon went back to his private study and opened a document he hadn't touched in years. An old idea for a universal education initiative that had once excited him before funding battles and legal threats shut it down. But this time, he didn't open it with numbers in mind. He started making notes about love, wonder, art, emotion. He wrote about the importance of nurturing children's inner world, not just feeding them facts. And for the first time in his career, he outlined a mission statement that didn't end with profitability or scalability, but with a simple question: what if we raised a generation that didn't forget how to listen? He began allocating quiet donations through a network of charities, ones focused on childhood grief, spiritual wellness, art therapy, and conscious parenting. He asked no one to promote it. He didn't attach his name. These weren't acts of marketing. They were acts of surrender. A surrender to the possibility that the most advanced intelligence on Earth might not be artificial, but the untapped grace living in every child's heart. Still, doubts lingered. Elon wasn't fully transformed. Part of him still sought evidence, still needed proof. And so he returned to Dr. Cohen. He asked her directly, why do children see these things? Why his son? Why now? She paused before answering, then said something that would live in Elon's mind for weeks. Maybe they see what we've forgotten, and maybe they're sent to remind us, not of where we're going, but of where we come from. That night, Elon didn't sleep. He sat at Jackson's bedside until morning, watching him breathe, listening for any whisper of music in the air. And when the sun rose, something inside him finally softened. Not into weakness, but into wonder. The final shift wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in the form of a breakthrough press conference or a revolutionary product launch. It came in quiet gestures. A handwritten note slipped into Jackson's lunchbox, a long overdue phone call to his estranged brother, an unpublicized visit to a pediatric hospice in Northern California where Elon simply sat, listening to terminally ill children describe dreams that mirrored Jackson's with haunting familiarity. He no longer questioned whether these visions were real in the scientific sense. He had stopped needing to know. Something more profound had taken root in him. Trust, not in equations, but in presence, not in certainty, but in compassion. He had come to accept that some truths couldn't be engineered or decoded. They had to be felt. One morning, Jackson woke up unusually early, just as the sky was beginning to blush with color. Elon found him standing at the edge of the garden, barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, looking up. He said he had another dream, but this one felt different. Not a return to heaven, but a message that he was here for a reason. And so was his father. That love wasn't a thing you gave when it was convenient. It was a light you carried through everything, even failure, even fear. Elon didn't reply with his usual careful tone or guarded silence. He just knelt beside him and asked what the message meant. Jackson touched his chest, over his heart, and said, "It means we have to be gentle with the world." That sentence would echo through Elon's mind during his next board meeting when he paused a heated debate over cost margins to ask what impact their next launch would have on the mental health of the children working indirectly in the supply chain. His colleagues stared, stunned. Elon didn't flinch. He was no longer designing rockets to escape Earth. He was designing systems to honor it. He went on to fund new programs focused not just on clean energy, but on emotional restoration, art-based recovery centers for children in war zones, silent, retreat schools teaching inner stillness alongside science. He launched an initiative where every SpaceX engineer would mentor a student from a background of loss, not to teach them code, but to teach them presence. These projects didn't get splashy headlines, and Elon didn't care. At home, life had grown slower, more deliberate. Meals were longer, shared. Music played in the background now. Classical, ambient, sometimes just the gentle sound of wind chimes Jackson had insisted on hanging near the windows. Elon had always hated noise. Now he found peace in letting it in. He kept one of Jackson's drawings, an image of a golden tree with open arms, framed on his desk. Visitors often asked about it, and Elon would just smile and say, "That's the reason I show up." In an interview months later, a journalist pressed Elon on why he'd taken such a different turn. Why the man known for logic and relentless ambition was now talking about empathy, dreams, and listening. Elon didn't offer a grand theory or a TED Talk answer. He simply said, "My son reminded me of something I never knew I'd forgotten, and maybe that was the point all along. The brilliance of space travel, of AI, of innovation. It would always dazzle. But there was a different kind of power, one that didn't make headlines or stock surges. A power born in dreams, in children's eyes, in the unprovable feeling that something bigger was calling us home." As for Jackson, he grew, still drawing, still humming, still grounded in that quiet wisdom. He never made a career of his vision, never chased the spotlight. He didn't have to. He had already changed the trajectory of a man who changed the world. And sometimes, when the house was quiet and the stars were just beginning to show, Elon would sit alone in the garden and close his eyes. Not to escape, but to listen, because now he finally remembered how.